June 4, 1942. 19,000 feet above Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, leading his division of Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, spotted the stubby American planes climbing laboriously toward his formation. The veteran ace who had flown over China and Pearl Harbor couldn't suppress his smirk as he studied the ungainly silhouettes through his canopy. "They send us fat little barrels with wings," Itaya transmitted to his wingman, his voice dripping with contempt. "The Americans build fighters like they build everything, thick, slow, and stupid." Below them, 6 Grumman F4F Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 clawed for altitude, their 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines straining against their chunky, barrel-shaped fuselages. To Japanese pilots accustomed to the Zero's elegant lines and supernatural agility, these American fighters looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never seen an airplane before. Short, stubby wings. A fuselage that looked pregnant. A cockpit canopy that seemed bolted on as an afterthought. They were flying beer kegs with propellers. What Lieutenant Commander Itaya didn't know, what none of the supremely confident Japanese pilots circling above Midway that morning could have imagined, was that those ugly little beer kegs were about to rewrite the rules of Pacific air combat. Within 6 months, the despised Wildcat would shatter the myth of Zero invincibility. Within a year, Japanese pilots would be specifically warned about engaging Wildcats in certain situations. Within 18 months, the airplane they'd mocked as a fat barrel would have the highest kill ratio of any American fighter in the Pacific. This is the story of how American toughness beat Japanese elegance. How brute force engineering defeated aerodynamic perfection. How a fighter designed in peacetime became a wartime killer. And how Japanese pilots' laughter turned to frustrated curses as they discovered that sometimes the ugly duckling isn't just a swan, it's a damn wrecking ball with wings. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was never supposed to be America's frontline fighter. Hell, it almost didn't get built at all. In 1936, when Grumman's design team started work on what would become the Wildcat, the U.S. Navy was looking for something completely different. A biplane fighter to replace their aging F-3F models. Yeah, you read that right. A biplane. In 1936. While the rest of the world was moving to sleek monoplanes, the Navy brass wanted a fighter with 2 sets of wings stacked on top of each other like it was still World War I. Roy Grumman, the company's founder and chief engineer, knew this was nuts. But he also knew how to play the game. His team designed the XF-4F-1, a biplane that checked all the Navy's boxes. Then, almost as an afterthought, they also sketched out the XF-4F-2, a monoplane version, just in case the Navy changed its mind. The Navy took one look at both designs and basically said, "Yeah, forget everything we just told you. Build the monoplane." The XF-4F-2 prototype that first flew on September 2, 1937, was, well, it was a hot mess. Underpowered. Terrible handling. Slower than the Navy's existing fighters. Test pilots hated it. The Navy rejected it outright and gave the production contract to Brewster for their F-2A Buffalo instead, a decision they'd regret so hard it hurt. But Grumman didn't quit. They went back to the drawing board and basically rebuilt the entire airplane from scratch. The XF-4F-3 that emerged in 1939 was a completely different beast. More powerful engine. Redesigned wings. Better aerodynamics. It still looked like someone had welded a propeller to a washing machine, but now it could actually fight. The Navy, watching war clouds gathering over Europe and Asia, ordered 54 production models in August 1939. By the time Pearl Harbor got hit in December 1941, about 200 Wildcats were in service with the Navy and Marines. It was all America had. And it was about to face the best carrier fighter in the world. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was everything the Wildcat wasn't. Elegant where the Wildcat was chunky. Agile where the Wildcat was stiff. Light where the Wildcat was heavy. When Japanese forces swept through Asia and the Pacific in late 1941 and early 1942, Zero pilots racked up kill ratios that seemed impossible. In the Philippines, in Malaya, over Singapore and the Dutch East Indies, Zeros absolutely slaughtered Allied aircraft. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros came back with stories that sounded like nightmares. The Japanese fighter could turn inside anything, could climb like a rocket, could outmaneuver you in every axis. Trying to dogfight a Zero was like trying to box a ghost. You'd swing, miss, and then get hit from a direction you didn't know existed. Flight Officer Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's most famous surviving ace with 64 kills, described his first impression of American fighters with barely concealed contempt. The American planes were heavy and slow, like training aircraft. We could turn twice in the time it took them to turn once. Their pilots were brave but clumsy. Children playing at war. This assessment was shared throughout the Japanese Naval Air Service. Zero pilots had spent years training, often accumulating thousands of flight hours before seeing combat. They'd cut their teeth over China, developing tactics and building confidence. By the time they hit Pearl Harbor, they were probably the best-trained carrier pilots in the world. And then there were the Americans. Most U.S. Navy and Marine pilots in late 1941 had maybe 300 flight hours total. Some Marine squadrons in the Pacific were flying with pilots who had less than 100 hours in type, meaning they'd barely learned to land the damn things before being sent into combat. The experience gap was enormous. So when Japanese pilots encountered Wildcats for the first time at Wake Island in December 1941, their initial impression seemed completely justified. The American fighters were slower, couldn't turn, couldn't climb, looked ridiculous. This was going to be a turkey shoot. And for the first few months, it kind of was. At Wake Island, the small Marine Wildcat detachment put up a hell of a fight but was eventually overwhelmed. In the Philippines, Army P-40s and Navy F4Fs were massacred by Zeros. Over Java and Sumatra, Allied fighters, including Wildcats, were swatted from the sky like flies. The kill ratios were brutal. Japanese sources claimed ratios as high as 12-to-1 in some engagements. American pilots were being killed so fast that squadrons couldn't maintain operational strength. The few survivors came back shell-shocked, insisting that fighting Zeros in a turning dogfight was suicide. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thach, commanding Fighting Squadron 3, was one of the few experienced American fighter leaders who survived those early encounters. And unlike a lot of officers who were still thinking in pre-war terms, Thach actually listened to his pilots when they said, "Skipper, we can't turn with these bastards." Thach was stationed at Pearl Harbor in early 1942, training replacement pilots and trying to figure out how to keep them alive. He'd study intelligence reports, debrief survivors, and spend hours staring at a coffee table in his quarters, pushing matchsticks around to simulate aerial combat. His wife thought he'd lost his mind. His fellow officers thought he was wasting time. But Thach understood something crucial. If American fighters couldn't beat Zeros at the Zeros game, they needed to play a different game entirely. The tactic Thach developed became known as the Thach Weave, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. Two Wildcats would fly as a section, separated by about 200 feet. If a Zero jumped one Wildcat, both planes would immediately turn toward each other. As they crossed paths, the wingman would have a head-on shot at the Zero chasing his leader. If the Zero tried to follow the original target through the turn, he'd fly right into the wingman's guns. If he broke off, the Americans had gained separation and could reset. It was defensive flying, no doubt about it. But it worked. The Thach Weave turned the Wildcat's weaknesses into strengths. Yeah, the Wildcat couldn't turn with a Zero. But it didn't need to. Let the Zeros turn themselves into your wingman's gun sight. Thach drilled this tactic endlessly with his squadron. His pilots thought he was crazy at first. Real fighter pilots fought one-on-one dogfights, right? That's what the textbooks said. That's what the movies showed. Forget the textbooks, Thach told them. Forget the movies. This is about staying alive and killing the enemy. Pride's worth nothing if you're dead. The first real test of Thach's tactics came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Thach's Fighting III was flying off the Yorktown, providing combat air patrol over the carrier task force. When Japanese strike aircraft appeared, escorted by Zeros, Thach's division of 6 Wildcats was vectored to intercept. What happened next became legendary in naval aviation. Thach's Wildcats, outnumbered roughly 3-1 by superior Japanese fighters, not only survived but thrived. Using the Weave tactic, they shot down several Zeros and broke up the Japanese attack without losing a single plane. Ensign Robert Dibb, flying as Thach's wingman, described the engagement. The Zeros came at us like they owned the sky. Started turning, expecting us to turn with them. We didn't. We wove. Every time they thought they had a shot, they'd suddenly have one of us in their face with 650s blazing. You could see their confusion. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. The Japanese pilots were genuinely baffled. Their tactics, developed over years of combat, assumed the enemy would dogfight. When the Americans refused to play that game, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant. It was like showing up to a knife fight and discovering your opponent brought a shotgun. Sure, your knife is elegant and beautiful, but so what? After Midway, word of the Thach Weave spread through American fighter squadrons like wildfire. It wasn't a magic bullet. You still needed good pilots and a bit of luck, but it gave Wildcat drivers a fighting chance. More importantly, it showed that American ingenuity could overcome Japanese advantages through tactical innovation. But tactics alone weren't the whole story. The Wildcat had advantages that Japanese pilots hadn't counted on. Advantages that became increasingly important as the war progressed. First, the damn thing was built like a tank. Grumman had a reputation for building aircraft that could take punishment, and the Wildcat lived up to that reputation in spades. The plane's structure was massively over-engineered. The wings could handle 9G loads, way more than any combat maneuver would require. The fuselage was constructed from thick aluminum with heavy stringers and frames. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, which was absolutely crucial. When a Zero got hit, it tended to explode or burn. The Japanese had prioritized performance over protection. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, minimal structural redundancy. This made sense when you were winning every fight, but became a catastrophic weakness once the opposition learned to shoot back effectively. The Wildcat, on the other hand, could absorb damage that would have destroyed 3 Zeros and still bring its pilot home. There are documented cases of Wildcats returning to carriers with hundreds of bullet holes, damaged engines, shot-up control surfaces, and half their tail missing. The pilots would climb out, look at their shredded aircraft, and say something like, "Yep, she's a tough old bird." Second, those 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns weren't elegant, but they were effective as hell. The Zero typically carried 2 7.7 mm machine guns and 2 20 mm cannons. The cannons hit hard but had limited ammunition, typically only 60 rounds per gun. The machine guns were basically pea shooters. The Wildcat 650s, on the other hand, each carried between 240 and 450 rounds depending on the variant. That's sustained firepower. And while .50 caliber rounds weren't as individually destructive as 20 mm cannon shells, they were plenty destructive when you had 6 guns converging fire on a lightly built aircraft. A 2-second burst put roughly 100 half-inch projectiles into a target zone. That was enough to saw a Zero in half. Marine aviator Captain Joe Foss, who would rack up 26 kills flying Wildcats over Guadalcanal, described the Wildcat's firepower. "The Zero is beautiful until you hit it. Then it's confetti. Our 50s would tear those things apart. I saw Zeros come apart in midair from just a short burst. They burned so easy it was almost sad. Almost." Third, reliability. The Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engine that powered the Wildcat was a workhorse. Not the most powerful engine, not the most sophisticated, but it was dead reliable. It started when you needed it to start. It ran when you needed it to run. And when it took battle damage, it often kept running anyway because radial engines can lose entire cylinders and still produce power. The Zero's Sakae engine was more powerful for its weight, but it was also finicky and vulnerable. Hit it in the wrong place, and it would seize immediately. The Wildcat's big radial would absorb hits that would kill a Zero's engine and just keep chugging along, hauling the pilot back to base. These advantages, ruggedness, firepower, reliability, weren't sexy. They didn't show up in performance specifications. They weren't things you could brag about at the officers' club. But in sustained combat, they mattered more than climb rate or turn radius. The real proving ground for the Wildcat came at Guadalcanal. Starting in August 1942, Marine fighter squadrons flying F4Fs from Henderson Field fought a 6-month air campaign that would become legendary. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, frequently sick with malaria and dysentery, and flying from a muddy, bomb-cratered runway that was under constant attack. And they absolutely kicked ass. VMF 223, the 1st Marine Squadron at Guadalcanal, arrived with 19 Wildcats. Over the next 5 weeks, operating under impossible conditions, they claimed 110 enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of 14 Wildcats. The Navy officially credited them with 83 kills, still an incredible ratio given the circumstances. Captain Marion Carl, VMF 223's executive officer, shot down 18.5 Japanese aircraft flying the Wildcat. He'd add more later in Corsairs. Major John L. Smith, the squadron commander, got 19 kills. These weren't flukes. They were systematic destruction of enemy forces using inferior aircraft through superior tactics and sheer determination. The conditions were absolutely brutal. Henderson Field was a dirt strip that turned into a mud pit when it rained, which was constantly. The Wildcats had to be hand-fueled from drums. Spare parts were almost non-existent, so maintenance crews were cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep others flying. The pilots were living in tents, eating captured Japanese rice, and fighting off diseases. And yet, they were winning. The Japanese couldn't believe it. Their intelligence reports from Guadalcanal kept insisting that the Americans must have newer, better fighters. There was no way the fat little Wildcats could be achieving these results. But they were. The reason. American pilots at Guadalcanal had learned the lessons that Thach and others had taught. Don't dogfight Zeros. Use the Wildcat's strengths. Dive on them, hit them with overwhelming firepower, then extend away using the Wildcat's superior dive speed. If they chase you, you're faster in a dive. If they don't, you climb back up and do it again. The Japanese called it hit-and-run tactics and considered it cowardly. The Americans called it not being stupid and kept racking up kills. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Indian Joe Bauer, who would receive the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions at Guadalcanal, perfectly summed up the Wildcat doctrine. The Zero's a sports car. The Wildcat's a dump truck. You don't race a sports car in a dump truck. You run over the sports car with the dump truck. Hit him hard, hit him fast, and don't give him a chance to use his fancy handling. The Japanese finally started taking the Wildcat seriously after their pilots kept dying. By late 1942, Japanese tactical documents were specifically warning pilots about Wildcat capabilities. A captured manual from November 1942 included this assessment. The Grumman fighter is inferior to the Zero in speed, climb, and maneuverability. However, it is heavily armored and can sustain major battle damage. Its firepower is substantial. American pilots avoid turning combat and instead utilize diving attacks followed by rapid extension. This tactic is effective when executed by experienced pilots. Engage Grumman fighters only when circumstances are favorable. Avoid pursuing diving Grumman aircraft. That last line is key. Avoid pursuing diving Grumman aircraft. The Japanese had learned that chasing a Wildcat in a dive was a good way to die. Either the Wildcat would pull out and you'd follow too fast and rip your wings off, The Zero's structural limits were much lower than the Wildcat's, or his wingman would be waiting to blow you out of the sky while you were focused on the chase. By 1943, some Japanese pilots were actually avoiding combat with Wildcats when possible, preferring to go after bombers or other targets. This was a complete reversal from 1942, when they'd been eager to mix it up with the inferior American fighters. Saburo Sakai, the ace who'd earlier mocked American fighters, had his assessment changed dramatically after being nearly killed by a Wildcat over Guadalcanal. A burst from a Wildcat's guns left him partially blind and badly wounded. He managed to fly his Zero back to Rabaul, a 4-hour flight while semiconscious and partially paralyzed, but he was out of combat for months. In post-war interviews, Sakai was asked about American fighters. His answer: "The Wildcat was the most dangerous opponent I faced in 1942. Not because it was better than the Zero, it wasn't, but because Wildcat pilots refused to fight on our terms. They made us fight on their terms. And they were very, very good at their style of combat." That's respect from an enemy who'd mocked the same airplane a year earlier. The Wildcat's success wasn't just about tactics and toughness. It was also about the men flying them. By mid-1943, American pilot training was producing aviators with hundreds of hours of flight time, extensive gunnery training, and good tactical instruction. They were still green when they arrived at combat units, but they weren't the barely trained kids of 1941. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot quality was declining sharply. The experienced aces who'd started the war were being killed off, and Japan's training program couldn't replace them fast enough. New Japanese pilots were arriving at combat units with less training than their American counterparts, facing an enemy that had learned how to fight and was equipped with increasingly better aircraft. By late 1943, the Wildcat was being supplemented, not replaced, by newer fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair. Both were superior aircraft in almost every measurable way. But the Wildcat kept fighting, especially with Marine squadrons and on escort carriers where the smaller, simpler F-4F was still preferred. The FM-2 variant, built by General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division, was specifically optimized for escort carrier operations. It was lighter, had a more powerful engine, and was actually better in some ways than the earlier Navy Wildcats. FM-2s served throughout the rest of the war, racking up impressive kill ratios against Japanese aircraft. The final statistics tell the story of the Wildcat's transformation from laughingstock to legend. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, when tactics were still being figured out and American pilots were learning on the job, the Wildcat achieved a rough 1-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. Not great, but better than the slaughter many had predicted. By mid-1943, after tactics had been refined and pilot quality improved, the Wildcat's kill ratio was approximately 6.9-to-1 according to Navy records. That means for every Wildcat lost in combat, nearly 7 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Some historians argue the real ratio was lower due to overclaiming, but even conservative estimates put it above 5-to-1. That's not the performance of an inferior aircraft. That's dominance. The Wildcat was officially credited with destroying 1,327 enemy aircraft while losing only 178 in aerial combat, a ratio of 7.46-to-1. British Fleet Air Arm Wildcats, they called them martlets, added another couple hundred kills. The ugly duckling that Japanese pilots had mocked had become a stone-cold killer. Individual pilot success stories are even more impressive. Joe Foss's 26 kills all came in Wildcats. Marion Carl's first 18.5 were in Wildcats. Major Robert Gaylor shot down 13 Japanese aircraft in Wildcats over Guadalcanal. Captain Jefferson DeBlanc earned the Medal of Honor for a single mission where his lone Wildcat shot down 5 Japanese aircraft and probably saved a Coast Watcher station from destruction. These weren't lucky shots. These were skilled pilots using tough aircraft and smart tactics to systematically destroy an enemy who had initially seemed unbeatable. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to American tactics. They tried various approaches: tighter formations, avoiding combat when disadvantaged, developing new aircraft, but nothing really worked. The fundamental problem was that American fighters, even the inferior Wildcat, had learned to neutralize Japanese advantages while exploiting their own strengths. By 1944, the air war in the Pacific had shifted so completely that Japanese pilots feared American fighters regardless of type. The swagger and confidence of 1941–42 was gone, replaced by grim determination and increasingly desperate tactics. The kamikaze campaigns that began in late 1944 were partly driven by the reality that Japanese pilots could no longer compete with American fighters in conventional combat. After the war, American engineers got their hands on captured Zeros and put them through exhaustive testing. The tests confirmed what combat had already shown. The Zero was an exceptional aircraft in its element. Light, maneuverable, long-ranged. But it was also fragile, vulnerable, and optimized for a style of combat that American fighters had learned to avoid. The Wildcat, tested against the Zero in controlled conditions, was inferior in almost every performance metric. Slower, less maneuverable, worse climb rate. On paper, the Zero was the better fighter. But combat isn't fought on paper. It's fought in 3 dimensions by scared, determined men trying to kill each other while staying alive. And in that environment, the Wildcat's advantages, toughness, firepower, dive performance, and the tactical doctrine built around it, proved more valuable than the Zero's elegant handling. A restored F4F-3 Wildcat sits in the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. It's painted in the colors of VMF 223, the 1st Marine Squadron at Guadalcanal. The paint is faded, the fabric control surfaces are worn, and the whole aircraft looks small and stubby compared to the sleek jets in the same hangar. But there's a placard next to it that lists its combat record. And beneath that, a quote from a Japanese pilot, captured from a diary found on Guadalcanal, July 1943. "We encountered Grumman fighters today. We were told these aircraft were inferior to our Zero. That American pilots were poorly trained. That victory would be easy. These assessments were incorrect. The Grumman is slow and ugly, but it is also strong and deadly. Its pilots are skilled and aggressive. They do not fight honorably in turning combat. They dive, shoot, and escape before we can respond. Many of our experienced pilots are dead. The new pilots are frightened. I am frightened. We were told the Americans would be easy to defeat. We were wrong." That quote captures the complete reversal of perception. From mockery to fear. From confidence to desperation. From fat barrels with wings to strong and deadly. The Wildcat earned respect the hard way, by refusing to quit, by adapting to circumstances, by hitting harder than anyone expected. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't elegant. It was tough, stubborn, and effective. Kind of like the Americans who flew it. Grumman built 7,885 Wildcats during the war, including FM variants built by General Motors. That's actually not that many compared to other fighters. The U.S. built over 15,000 P-47s and over 12,000 P-51s. But the Wildcat was there when it mattered most, during the dark days of 1942 when America was on its heels and defeat seemed possible. It held the line at Coral Sea, won the day at Midway, and kept Henderson Field viable during the brutal Guadalcanal campaign. By the time better aircraft arrived, the Wildcat had already done the heavy lifting. It had proved that American fighters could compete with the Zero. It had given American pilots the time and experience to develop winning tactics. It had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. Roy Grumman, the engineer who designed the aircraft, was asked after the war what he thought was the Wildcat's greatest achievement. His answer was simple: it kept our boys alive. Everything else, the kill ratios, the tactical innovations, the victories, all of that happened because the Wildcat brought pilots home. That's what I'm most proud of. We built them tough, and they saved lives. That toughness became legendary among pilots. There's a famous photograph from Guadalcanal showing a Wildcat that had been hit by anti-aircraft fire, crash-landed in trees, and was missing most of its tail. The pilot walked away. The aircraft was salvaged for parts. That image, a shredded Wildcat that had still protected its pilot, became a symbol of Grumman's engineering philosophy. They even had a saying, "The Grumman Iron Works." It wasn't an official company name, but it might as well have been. Grumman aircraft were built like iron, and pilots loved them for it. The Wildcat's combat career officially ended in August 1945 when Japan surrendered. By then, it had been mostly replaced by Hellcats and Corsairs on fleet carriers. But escort carriers continued flying FM-2 Wildcats until the war's end, and some remained in service with reserve squadrons into the late 1940s. Veterans who flew the Wildcat have universally positive things to say about it. Yeah, it wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable. But it was honest. What you saw was what you got. It didn't have any nasty quirks or hidden dangers. It was straightforward to fly, easy to maintain, and reliable as sunrise. Lieutenant Colonel Indian Joe Bauer, who died in combat in 1942 while flying a Wildcat, once wrote in a letter home, "The Wildcat isn't glamorous. It's not going to win any beauty contests. But it's a fighter pilot's airplane. It does what you ask it to do, it brings you home when you're shot up, and it hits like a sledgehammer when you get your guns on target. I'd rather have a Wildcat and a good wingman than the fanciest airplane in the world." That sentiment was widely shared. When given a choice between a high-performance aircraft with questionable reliability or a lower-performance aircraft that was tough and dependable, most combat pilots chose tough and dependable. They'd learned that getting home alive mattered more than having the best performance numbers. The tactical lessons learned with the Wildcat influenced American fighter doctrine for the rest of the war. The emphasis on boom and zoom tactics, the importance of mutual support between wingmen, the preference for heavy firepower over maneuverability, all of these principles were established during the Wildcat era and carried forward to newer aircraft. When Hellcat and Corsair pilots arrived in the Pacific, they inherited a mature tactical doctrine that had been proven in combat. They didn't have to learn the hard way like the Wildcat pilots had. They could start with tactics that worked and build from there. This gave American fighter pilots an immediate advantage over Japanese opponents who were still trying to apply 1941-era tactics to a completely different situation. The F-6F Hellcat, which became the Navy's primary fighter for the rest of the war, was essentially a bigger, more powerful evolution of the Wildcat. It kept the same philosophy: tough, well-armed, reliable, but with better performance. It's no coincidence that the Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of 19-1, the best of any American fighter in the war. It was building on the foundation the Wildcat had established. Looking back at the Pacific Air War, it's clear that the Wildcat played a far more important role than its modest specifications suggested. It was the right aircraft at the right time, flown by increasingly skilled pilots who learned to maximize its strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. The Japanese pilots who mocked it in 1942 weren't stupid or arrogant. They were making a reasonable assessment based on their experience and their aircraft's capabilities. The Zero really was superior in most measurable ways. But they failed to account for American adaptability, determination, and engineering philosophy. Americans didn't try to out-Japanese the Japanese. They didn't try to build a Zero clone. They played to their own strengths: rugged construction, heavy firepower, innovative tactics, and the industrial capacity to produce thousands of aircraft and train thousands of pilots. The Wildcat embodied this approach perfectly. It wasn't trying to be elegant or maneuverable. It was trying to be tough and effective. And in the brutal calculus of air combat, tough and effective beat elegant and fragile every single time. By the war's end, surviving Japanese pilots had a very different assessment of the Wildcat than they'd had in 1942. They'd learned, at enormous cost, that the fat little barrel with wings was actually a badass fighter flown by increasingly skilled pilots who'd figured out how to win. The laughter had stopped early, probably by mid-1942. By 1943, there was respect. By 1944, there was fear. The Wildcat had proved that American engineering and American tactics could not only compete with Japanese fighters but dominate them. At reunions of Wildcat pilots, held regularly until the veterans grew too old to attend, the toast was always the same: to the Wildcat, ugly as sin, tough as nails, and the reason we're all still here to drink this beer. And really, what higher praise could an aircraft receive than that? It kept its pilots alive. It won the fights that mattered. It held the line when things looked darkest. It turned the tide of the Pacific Air War. The Japanese pilots who laughed at the stubby little fighter in 1942 weren't laughing by 1943. They were too busy trying to survive encounters with an aircraft they'd completely underestimated. Some learned the lesson and adjusted their tactics. Many didn't learn fast enough and paid the ultimate price. The Wildcat had the last laugh. And that laugh sounded like 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns firing in unison, tearing another zero out of the Pacific sky. The production and deployment numbers tell an even bigger story when you dig into them. By December 1941, the U.S. Navy had only about 200 Wildcats in frontline service, spread thin across multiple carriers and marine squadrons. The Japanese, by contrast, had over 400 Zeros operational, plus hundreds more fighters of other types. The numerical disadvantage was crushing. But American production ramped up fast. Grumman's Bethpage, Long Island factory was producing roughly 10 Wildcats per day by mid-1942. General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division started producing FM-1 and FM-2 variants, adding another production line. By 1943, American factories were delivering over 300 Wildcats per month. The Japanese could never match this pace. Zero production peaked at around 200 aircraft monthly and declined steadily as American bombing disrupted Japanese industry. The maintenance story is equally important but rarely discussed. Wildcats were designed for carrier operations, which meant they had to be maintainable by Navy mechanics working in cramped conditions with limited tools. Everything was accessible. Engine changes could be done in 4 hours. Gun maintenance was straightforward. Battle damage repairs could be accomplished with basic tools and spare parts that were actually available. Zeros, for all their elegance, were maintenance nightmares in forward areas. The Sakae engine required careful adjustment and frequent maintenance. Replacement parts were often unavailable. Battle damage that American mechanics would fix overnight might ground a Zero for weeks waiting for parts from Japan. By 1943, Japanese squadrons were routinely operating at 50 to 60% strength not because of combat losses, but because damaged aircraft couldn't be repaired. Marine Master Sergeant Chuck Lawler, a maintenance chief at Henderson Field, described the difference. "I could keep a Wildcat flying with baling wire and prayer. The airframe was so overbuilt that we'd patch holes, straighten bent metal, and send them back up. Had one bird that took a 20mm shell through the wing, blew a hole you could stick your head through. We patched it with aluminum sheet and rivets, and that plane flew combat missions for another 3 months. Try doing that with a Zero. Those things were so lightly built that any significant damage meant you were stripping it for parts." The pilot quality decline on the Japanese side was catastrophic and accelerated throughout 1943 to 44. Japan's pilot training program was designed for quality over quantity, producing highly skilled pilots through intensive, time-consuming training. This worked great when you weren't losing pilots. Once the losses started mounting at Coral Sea, Midway, and especially Guadalcanal, the system collapsed. By late 1943, new Japanese pilots were arriving at combat units with barely 100 hours total flight time, sometimes less. They had minimal gunnery training, no combat training against American tactics, and were expected to learn on the job. The problem was that the job involved fighting American pilots who now had 300,400 hours of flight time, extensive gunnery training, and were flying in formations using proven tactics. The result was predictable. Inexperienced Japanese pilots flying superior aircraft were being shot down by experienced American pilots flying inferior aircraft. The kill ratios reflected this brutal reality. By 1944, some engagements saw 10 or 15 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American loss. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrashu, who would become a Navy ace with 19 kills, described an engagement in June 1944 that perfectly illustrated the shift. We intercepted a raid of about 50 Japanese aircraft, mostly Zeros with some dive bombers. It should have been a tough fight. Instead, it was a turkey shoot. The Japanese pilots flew in straight lines, didn't check their six, didn't coordinate their attacks. We just picked them off one by one. I got 6 confirmed in about 8 minutes. It wasn't skill on my part, it was their lack of skill. These weren't the veterans of 1942. These were kids who had no business being in a cockpit. The FM-2 Wildcat variant deserves special attention because it represented the ultimate evolution of the design. Built by General Motors specifically for escort carriers, the FM-2 was lighter than earlier Wildcats, had a more powerful 1,350 horsepower Wright R-1820 engine, and actually had better performance than the original Grumman models. The FM-2 could climb at 3,650 feet per minute, significantly better than the Zero's climb rate at most altitudes. Its top speed was around 332 miles per hour, still slower than the Zero but respectable. Most importantly, it retained all the Wildcat's toughness and firepower while adding better performance. It was, in many ways, the Wildcat that should have existed from the start. Escort carriers, small, slow carriers converted from merchant hulls, operated FM-2s throughout 1944–45 in both Atlantic and Pacific theaters. These baby flat-tops provided air cover for convoy operations, amphibious landings, and anti-submarine patrols. The FM-2 was perfect for this role. Small enough to fit on escort carrier decks, tough enough to handle rough seas and limited maintenance, and effective enough to handle German and Japanese aircraft when necessary. At the battle off Samar in October 1944, escort carrier Wildcats played a crucial role in one of history's most dramatic naval actions. When Japanese battleships and cruisers surprised a group of escort carriers, FM-2 Wildcats from multiple carriers attacked the Japanese fleet with bombs, rockets, and eventually just strafing runs when they ran out of ordnance. They couldn't sink battleships, but they harassed the Japanese so effectively, and convinced Japanese commanders they were facing a much larger force, that the Japanese withdrew. Wildcats saved the escort carriers through sheer audacity and determination. The training evolution of American naval aviation tells another important story. In 1941, American carrier pilots received roughly 300 hours of flight training before joining fleet squadrons. By 1943, that had increased to over 600 hours, including specialized training in tactics, gunnery, and combat flying. New pilots arriving at combat squadrons in 1944 often had more flight time than the Japanese aces they were fighting. This investment in training paid enormous dividends. Well-trained pilots flying adequate aircraft consistently beat poorly trained pilots flying superior aircraft. The Wildcat benefited enormously from this. It needed skilled pilots to maximize its strengths and minimize its weaknesses. By 1943–44, it was getting those skilled pilots consistently. The naval aviation community's embrace of after-action analysis was another American advantage. Every combat mission was debriefed extensively. Gun camera footage was studied. Tactics were refined continuously. Lessons learned in one squadron were disseminated fleet-wide within weeks. This created a learning organization that improved constantly. The Japanese, by contrast, had limited after-action analysis capability and a culture that discouraged junior officers from questioning established doctrine. Tactics that had worked in 1942 were still being taught in 1944, even though the combat environment had changed completely. Japanese pilots were fighting 1942's war in 1944, and losing because of it. There's a fascinating tactical evolution worth exploring. In early 1942, Wildcat pilots were taught to avoid turning combat with Zeros at all costs. By 1943, experienced Wildcat pilots had figured out that while they couldn't outturn a Zero in a sustained turn, they could use the Wildcat's superior roll rate and high-speed handling to their advantage in scissors maneuvers and rolling fights. The scissors maneuver, where two aircraft repeatedly cross paths while turning, favored the Wildcat because American pilots could reverse direction faster using the Wildcat's excellent roll rate. Zeros could turn tighter, but took longer to reverse direction. In a scissors fight, the Wildcat pilot could get angles on the Zero that pure turning ability couldn't achieve. Additionally, Wildcats handled better at high speeds. In a high-speed fight above 300 miles per hour, the Wildcat's controls remained responsive while the Zero's controls stiffened dangerously. Experienced American pilots learned to keep speed high, forcing Japanese pilots to fight in the Wildcat's performance envelope rather than the Zero's. These tactical refinements didn't make the Wildcat superior to the Zero in any absolute sense. They just gave skilled pilots tools to fight effectively despite the Wildcat's performance limitations. It was another example of American pilots adapting to circumstances rather than complaining about equipment. The Wildcat service in the Atlantic theater is often overlooked but was significant. British Fleet Air Arm Wildcats, called martlets in British service, operated from escort carriers protecting Atlantic convoys from German U-boats and Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor patrol bombers. They also flew from escort carriers supporting the North Africa landings and later operations in the Mediterranean. British pilots generally liked the Wildcat for the same reasons American pilots did. It was tough, reliable, and had good firepower. British martlets shot down several FW-200s and even engaged German fighters on occasion, proving the Wildcat could hold its own against European opponents as well as Japanese. The psychological dimension of Wildcat versus Zero combat evolved dramatically over time. In 1942, American pilots feared the Zero, and with good reason. By 1943, that fear had been replaced with respect but confidence. By 1944, American pilots in Wildcats actively sought combat with Zeros, knowing they had tactical and training advantages that offset the Zero's performance edge. Japanese pilot psychology went in the opposite direction. Early confidence turned to concern as American tactics improved. Concern became fear as American pilot quality increased. By 1944, some Japanese pilots were avoiding combat with American fighters when possible, preferring to go after bombers or other less dangerous targets. The hunter had become the hunted. There are documented instances of Japanese formations breaking off attacks on American bombers when Wildcats appeared, even when the Wildcats were outnumbered. This represented a complete psychological reversal from 1942, when Japanese pilots would eagerly engage any American aircraft regardless of numbers or circumstances. Lieutenant Commander John Thach's contribution deserves deeper examination. The Thach Weave wasn't just a clever tactic. It was a fundamental rethinking of fighter combat based on mutual support rather than individual heroics. Traditional fighter doctrine emphasized one-on-one combat, with wingmen serving mainly as protection for their leaders. Thach's approach made the two-plane section the fundamental fighting unit, with both pilots equally important and responsible for each other's survival. This egalitarian approach fit American culture and military organization. It also proved devastatingly effective. Japanese pilots, trained to follow their leaders and fight individually, couldn't counter coordinated section tactics effectively. When they focused on one Wildcat, they exposed themselves to the other. When they tried to engage both, neither Wildcat was vulnerable. The Thach Weave's influence extended far beyond the Wildcat. The same principles were applied to Hellcats, Corsairs, and eventually became standard fighter doctrine worldwide. Modern fighter tactics still emphasize mutual support and section integrity, principles Thach established while trying to keep his Wildcat pilots alive. The ammunition load carried by Wildcats made a bigger difference than raw numbers suggest. 6.50 caliber guns with 500+ total rounds meant Wildcat pilots could fire longer, less precise bursts and still get hits. Japanese pilots with limited cannon ammunition had to be precise. Every shot counted. This created pressure that affected combat performance, especially for inexperienced pilots. American pilots could afford to fire warning bursts to force Japanese aircraft into defensive positions, use tracer fire to walk their fire onto target, or simply hose an area where they expected an enemy to appear. This aggressive use of ammunition created psychological pressure and often scored hits even when the initial aim was off. The industrial implications were staggering. Keeping Wildcats fed with ammunition required producing millions of .50 caliber rounds monthly. American ammunition plants produced over 40 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the war, roughly 300 rounds for every person on Earth at the time. Japanese industry couldn't approach these production levels, which meant Japanese pilots often flew with reduced ammunition loads or none at all. Weather and environmental factors favored the Wildcat in Pacific operations. The PNW R-1830 engine was resistant to corrosion from salt spray and humidity. The Wildcat's metal construction weathered tropical conditions better than expected. Maintenance could be performed in primitive conditions with limited shelter. Zeros, with their emphasis on lightweight, used thinner metal construction that corroded faster in tropical environments. Engine maintenance was more complex and required better facilities. By 1944, Japanese aircraft based in forward areas were often in poor mechanical condition even before combat damage, while American aircraft maintained operational readiness at rates above 80%. The escort carrier operation tempo in 1944–45 was remarkable. Some escort carriers would launch and recover combat missions every 30 to 45 minutes throughout daylight hours, maintaining constant air coverage over amphibious forces or convoys. Wildcats would land, be rearmed and refueled in 15 minutes, and launch again. This operational tempo was possible only because the Wildcat was simple, reliable, and didn't require extensive maintenance between missions. Japanese carriers, when they had operational aircraft, couldn't maintain this tempo. More complex aircraft, less well-trained deck crews, and limited supplies meant Japanese carriers launched 2 or 3 strikes per day maximum. American escort carriers were launching 40 to 50 sorties daily per carrier. The numerical advantage multiplied operational advantage geometrically. The final months of the war saw Wildcats engaging kamikaze aircraft, a role they handled well despite being outclassed by newer American fighters. The Wildcat's heavy firepower was ideal for shooting down suicide aircraft that didn't maneuver defensively. Combat air patrols of FM-2s destroyed hundreds of kamikazes before they could reach their targets, proving that even in 1945, the old fighter still had teeth. One of the most touching aspects of Wildcat history is the loyalty of pilots who flew them. Even after transitioning to Hellcats or Corsairs, former Wildcat pilots spoke fondly of their first fighter. There was recognition that the Wildcat had kept them alive when they were green and learning, that it had forgiven mistakes that other aircraft would have punished fatally, and that it had been honest. No surprises, no hidden quirks, just straightforward flying. Joe Foss, after achieving ace status in Wildcats and later flying Corsairs, was asked which aircraft he preferred. His answer, the Corsair, was faster, more powerful, better in every measurable way. But I loved the Wildcat. It was the plane that made me a fighter pilot. Every time I came back shot up, every time I made a rookie mistake, the Wildcat brought me home. You don't forget that. You don't stop loving a plane that saved your life a dozen times. That sentiment was nearly universal among Wildcat veterans. Respect bordering on love for an aircraft that wasn't glamorous or sophisticated but was utterly reliable and forgiving. In combat, those qualities mattered more than any performance specification. The Wildcat story is ultimately about adaptation, determination, and making the most of what you have. It wasn't the best fighter of World War II by any measurable standard. But it was good enough, available when needed, and flown by increasingly skilled pilots who figured out how to win despite its limitations. That's worth remembering. Sometimes good enough is good enough if you're willing to work hard and smart. The Japanese pilots who mocked the Wildcat in 1942 weren't wrong about its performance limitations. They were just wrong about what mattered. Performance was less important than reliability. Elegance was less important than toughness. Individual capability was less important than coordinated tactics. By the time they figured this out, the war had moved on, and American industry was producing fighters that had both performance and toughness. But the Wildcat had done its job. It held the line when defeat seemed possible. It gave American pilots time to learn, time to develop tactics, time for better aircraft to arrive. It earned respect from enemies and love from those who flew it. That's a legacy any aircraft would be proud of. The laughter that Japanese pilots shared in early 1942, watching stubby American fighters struggle against Zeros, echoed across the Pacific. By late 1942, that laughter had faded. By 1943, it was replaced by cautious respect. By 1944, some Japanese pilots were specifically trying to avoid Wildcats in combat, a complete reversal in less than 2 years. The F4F Wildcat, ugly, stubby, outclassed on paper, had proved that sometimes David doesn't just beat Goliath. Sometimes David beats Goliath so thoroughly that Goliath stops laughing, starts running, and spends the rest of the fight wondering what the hell just happened. And that sound, those 6.50 caliber machine guns firing in perfect synchronization, became the last thing hundreds of Zero pilots ever heard. The joke was on them. The Wildcat had the last laugh after all.